This is Bam Pow Comic Hour with your hosts, Andrew Glonner
and Chris Ramos.
Heck yeah. This episode will feature the Absolute Swamp Thing, the Saga of the Swamp Thing number 20, all the way through Saga of the Swamp Thing number 34, which also includes annuals number 1 and number 2. And to complete the title, this is actually where Alan Moore gets his start.
Yes, correct. And everyone, what we're trying to do is bring attention to the hardcover collected editions. So the Absolute editions in DC, this will be our first Absolute that we're reviewing. Mm-hmm. It's even larger format than an omnibus. And I think what they do with Absolutes and the idea behind them is that they put them in a large format with a ribbon in the middle that you can keep track of where you're writing. They put them in a big slip cover and just make them like more of a showpiece. They're generally around the same size as like in length. So you'll see like Absolutes number 1, Absolute number 2, Absolute number 3, continuing the story, where otherwise they would put it into one giant hardcover in a smaller size.
Yeah.
So they keep them as more of art pieces. The biggest draw is that the artwork is almost the actual size.
Yeah, so it feels like doubled in size, which makes for a really cool and interesting experience, especially if you like the comic art. This is like one of the best ways to read it.
Yeah, because it actually brings attention to the artwork and the colors and just sort of the flow of the page, and you can appreciate it a little better, I think, how they're trying to put together the book. Because most comic art will start out at a larger size, like almost 11 by 17, and they'll ink it and color it and get it published and then shrink it down, which tightens up all the details. So people who are loose or even have already sort of real tight art to begin with, once you shrink it down, it just tightens everything up. So that works a lot better that way.
So Swamp Thing to me is such a underrated character, and I'm glad that he's finally getting some justice these days, because now we have the HBO or DC Universe first produced the Swamp Thing run. Gave it a real revamp from this movie that they made in like the 80s. And now, to promote it, that was one of the reasons why they did. Like, they have the original Swamp Thing run that Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson put together. They're like, oh, let's put a movie to it. And then if we make this movie, then people read the comics. Well, that movie was pretty terrible. But the comics were way better.
They did what they could in the 80s with the comic book movies. It took a little while for that to catch on.
Mm-hmm. Like, you can supervise as much as you want, but it's a little rough. It's like, what?
And the other, nice part of the Absolute edition is it collects Alan Moore as the writer, and he stepped into the role after the 19th issue. So they went 1 through 19, and while that was a good run by Len Wein, it has some great stories and story writing. It's still considered Bronze Age, yeah.
Yep. So there was a few other writers that came with that run that I'll briefly mention, like Martin Pasco, David Michelinie, Jerry Conway, Bruce Jones, even Wes Craven gets an issue, and David Anthony Kraft. They get issues just because like that run was they try things. Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson had a 10-issue run, and then Martin Pasco picks it up, and every once in a while you can't make a deadline, so they'll hire another writer and colorist and team to like do a fill-in issues, and that's great. But it was a little they wanted to do a revamp, and what I heard from Stephen Bassett, the artist in the featured artist in Absolute Swamp Thing, and Alan Moore, was that DC called him up, and that was Len Wein. Len Wein calls up Alan Moore. He's the editor at the time, and he goes, hey, we're interested in doing a revamp of Swamp Thing. Are you interested? And this was before Alan Moore was big, so he was doing some British magazines and, smaller works, but, he was building his reputation up. And he's like, yeah, I would love to do this.
I think one of the earlier ones that he had already published was V for Vendetta. That
That I
came
think
out
that was a little later.
that came out in 1982.
Oh, 82. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So
Cool.
he was, I
I
think,
guess maybe it didn't get known until later.
yeah, he had some, yeah, he had some writing chops a little bit, but I think the other part of it was most of those writers that are in the Bronze Age Swamp Thing are straight up horror writers.
Yeah.
Swamp Thing started out as a horror
Yep.
character, yeah.
But it's still, they consider, I think Alan Moore considers this like hokey, that the concepts of horror don't age well. Like it's
Oh,
good
right.
for what like the Bronze Age was. It was still kind of superhero-y, but just a little more horror, kind of like what um, Dracula was at the time, and things like that. Blade, and they still had the same tropes. It definitely had it had its moments, and I'd say the art changes and everything. And I guess my favorite thing about the old Swamp Thing run, just to kind of give it a good idea, was it built a good cast. It has a good running story that you can easily follow through, and the writing's really good. The arts after Burning Rhinestone, it's okay. They do their best with what they can, but I don't think it stands out.
Mhm.
So when the sales started declining, whenever, but horror was coming back in like the early 80s with all like the slasher films and everything. From what I watched in his interviews, they're like, hey,
Now is a perfect
now
time.
is a perfect time to try Swamp Thing again. And they liked what Alan Moore was doing. And they're like, hey, this is a cool vibe. Would you be interested?
And the funny part of it all is Alan Moore was part of what's called um, the British invasion of comics.
Yeah. Yep.
So everyone knows British invasion of musical art, but it was the British invasion of comics, and that was Alan Moore and Grant Morrison and Warren Ellis, and they sort of came to the States in a little bit of a like a storm of writing that people had not been used to at all. They were it was totally outside of the regular comic book realms. It was totally outside of what
American writers doing,
America
for sure.
was building comics into. A lot of that influence for comics at the time in the early 80s was, sort of still stemming off of um, Batman being a hokey Adam West character on TV, and Spider-Man and everyone else having sort of a hokey sort of um, quirky quirkiness to them. So when the British writers came over, I don't want to say that they brought sort of their own way of doing it, but British comedy and British writing is pretty grown up,
and it's unique to that style.
Yeah, like people had not really read a lot of that type of, kind of poetry in some parts. They just didn't realize that could be translated into the comic book form. So Alan Moore, that's where he really started shining, and everyone really said, "Wow, this guy."
Yeah.
Oh, and Neil Gaiman. There's just so many British writers that came that they're like, "This guy's awesome."
Yeah. Right? Yeah. And I recently on YouTube, I was watching his old interviews from 84, 85, when probably the first issue, like 5 issues came out, I bet. And they're like, wow, this is so cool. And Alan Moore's happy. Like now, look at watching his interviews, he's kind of depressed. He's depressed and the cynic, and it's not a lot of fun to watch him. So watching this enthusiastic guy that he's so excited about comics, when he said, "Oh, he's like, I love movies, but the comic book is still his favorite medium." And he'll still say that. And I watched a recent interview. He's like, still likes it, but he doesn't like what they've done with it, like adaptations. He doesn't like his own movies. He doesn't, because he thinks it just gets lost
when they translate anything out of comic books, because
it's like almost a diehard, I guess, you would consider.
Yeah, and a lot of the traditionalists for artists and writers of comics, or artists and writers of fine art, or even movie buffs, things like that, they're so proud of their medium that they say, this is the only way that I can tell a story. and I think it would be like taking Quentin Tarantino out and saying, okay, write a book. He would say,
Oh yeah,
I need
that
to
would make no
show,
sense.
yeah, like I need to show this in film. And most comic book writers and artists say, this is how these characters were always meant to be shown. And this is how the story that I want to tell can be sort of laid out in a pacing that I want. And that's the thing. When you read comics, each page sort of has a lead up and a follow through, or a lead up and a reveal and
A twist and
a
a
twist.
turn.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you kind of go 2 or 3 pages and then it's like, wow, full page, something happens. 2 or 3 pages. Wow, that was weird. Well, 2 or 3 pages. And so the pacing of it is different than writing like a movie, or
Yeah.
something like that.
Sure.
So that's another thing we should mention. So Andrew read the Absolute Swamp Thing in the new printing, which is an absolute form. It has kind of a green, mossy, fuzzy cover, which
Yeah, it
is
has
awesome.
texture.
It's like
Texture.
from the swamp.
You can feel it go.
You have
Ooh.
a moss covered book and really high gloss pages, really, really great printing. But it kind of falls into what some people are notice, or what some people do or do not like. And the difference is I read it on Comixology, a digital platform, which has had the original artwork and original coloring.
That were in the trade paperbacks.
Yes, and in the original collected editions. Andrew read it in the new Absolute, which is all recolored.
Yep.
And what was the company that recolored it?
Huh?
Ali Optics.
Oh yeah. So Stephen Olaf and Ali Optics.
Yeah, so they went through and they recolored it and added shading, and they added some starburst effects, and they changed the coloring of backgrounds, and some people like that, some people don't. It's been a polarizing thing in the comics community lately because a lot of the collected editions are being recolored. Neil Adams, I think, was the most famous.
Oh yeah,
They
the
recolored
Batman
his
omnibus
Batman.
recovered. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of people, if you take the original comics and then you compare them to this new high gloss, recolored, shading, shadowed digital world, it's pretty different.
Yeah.
Very different. So
I'm a fan of this because I've read a lot of Silver Age, not a lot of Bronze Age. Silver Age being the 60s primarily, would you say?
Yeah.
Yep.
Bronze Age went into 70s.
Yeah, early 70s. Yeah. So Silver Age is fine. Depends what artists are working on it, the colors that are there, obviously. But it blends a little bit. It doesn't pop out. It doesn't have modern coloring ideals, I guess, or thinking about it. When I look at this, it's kind of brought up to modern standards, but it's also this like psychedelic trip. And I mean, it was still psychedelic for the time when the original version came out of the Alan Moore trade paperbacks and the series. It's still like really, I think, expansive, and they do a lot of experimenting and bring out the horror aspects of it. This is so cool. Like, it gives me like emotions, and like I can feel like the horror coming off of it, and some of the intensity kind of translates for me a little bit more.
Yeah, the only thing that, and for me, I'm not a big fan of the recoloring. So we can
This is why
we will argue this out. So bear with us for the next 4 hours. But to me, it's almost like, what's the point? Like, why would you go back into it and recolor it? I mean, why? To me, it's like going and taking some original pieces of artwork and then just recoloring them.
Sure.
And I don't know if the original writers and artists think that's a good idea. I think some of them are probably like, why did you have to go mess with everything we worked hard on?
Right.
But, to handle the larger format, or to handle a new high gloss page, maybe they needed to go back in and kind of clean up some areas. But this is legit a top to bottom recolor
Yeah,
of
the
almost
whole
every
book.
panel. Yeah.
Yep.
Um, I think that the artwork itself is, well, first of all, another unpopular comment.
Whoa.
I'm not like the biggest fan of Stephen Bissett. I mean,
Okay.
some parts cool, fine, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the biggest fan of his artwork. And I think to me, it looks like some pages are pretty cool, and then some pages are just straight up rushed. And I know they were under
4
deadlines.
weeks.
Yeah, well, I
So they
know they
had
were under
4
deadlines. They had
weeks.
to figure it
So
out.
just to break it down from what I was watching his interview, one of his recent interviews they had 4 weeks, and then the script would go from Alan Moore in England to DC. DC would approve the editor Len Wein or the other editor that came.
The other guy.
The other editor. I got this. I lost it.
You
Whatever.
got it.
Yeah. I can't. I'll find it later. And she came in, and she was still approving scripts and whatnot, but they would go from her, come down. The artist would get it. He would do pencils, and then he would send it to the colorist in Pennsylvania, and the letterer was like in Jersey. So they would like FedEx or Federal Express everything, and they just get it as soon as they could. And once like the issue was done, they would get scripts from Alan Moore and would continue that cycle every time.
And this was back in the day where everything was mailed.
Before the internet, man.
Yeah, FedExed. And
so when he's like, he did, I think he did a really good job for the time that he had and the ideas.
Well, his artwork reminds me of, like, it's really scratchy, right? So like,
sure.
And that's cool when you're reading the story, because the way that Alan Moore writes is very, well, I'll read a couple of things. I guess it's very like high prose, like people look at it as this is some great writing. There's a part in the later part of the Absolute where one of our main characters, she's going to the hospital and visiting, and outside there's trees growing kind of in the way of the hospital a little bit. So instead of just saying there's trees blocking the hospital, or there's trees growing into the foundation or something like that, Alan Moore writes, outside the rude young tendrils, supple and green, muscled upward through chinks in the turf's dark underbelly. You're like, okay. I mean, really trees. Well done. And
opposite of Bob Ross.
Yeah. and then she has some grief, and so even when he continues to write, it says, yes, she felt guilty, felt relieved, frightened, angry, all of those things, but the separate shades of her grief had merged like vivid modeling clays, crushed together into a single mauve-browned bruise. Bruises fade eventually. And so the way that he writes, it does reflect into the artwork in parts, and I do really enjoy that. It's sort of like this combination connection, but someday I will talk about Sandman, and I'm not the biggest fan of the artwork.
You okay?
I know. It's like here I'm a comics fan, and like the community is against me. But I just think his artwork in parts was a little lazy, and it it gets by because the writing is so good. So you think, okay, if you look at a panel, you're like, I don't need any more detail than what's in this panel, even though there isn't much and it feels a little, sloppy. But I get the idea she's falling, or I get the idea Swamp Thing is running, or I get the idea there's an insect. So you kind of have these simple visions, and the writing continues to push you through, so you don't take too long on the pages, because if you do spend a lot of time on the pages, you might step back and say, this artwork's not so good.
Another interesting fun fact about his art, he from the interview I listened to, he did the pages out of order. And DC was like, why aren't you doing this in order? They had like their OCD was going out of control. Like, he's like, man, this is how I do it. Okay. Len Wein, I'm sorry, but this is just how I operate. You can move me on to something else, or we can keep going.
So some
and this was
pages-
like after like
Yeah.
Swamp Thing, it was getting like success and everything. And they're like, fine, you do your thing, man.
Yeah, that's the other thing. So Alan Moore and Steve Bissette, they formed this sort of dynamic duo, and they took Swamp Thing from being a mediocre comic and they made it awesome, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, they made it a bestseller. They made it where they had a genuine fan base, and they made it where he was leading the charge to introduce the comic community to other characters, new ways of doing things, new
Yep.
ways to think about comics. In fact, I was screenshotting a few pages because there are times where the artwork and the writing is there isn't a straight panel anywhere. Like in a traditional comic, there's usually a 6-panel. I'm sorry,
Yep.
like an 8-panel page or
Yeah.
6-panel page.
And they kind of break the format.
Yeah, and they just got rid of all the panels and they just have things crawling and creeping around the edges and borders, and there's text all the way at the bottom.
So
and
would
there's
you
text
say
all the way at the top?
the recoloring benefits from it?
Well, no.
No.
I think the recoloring, if you look at parts of it, so I guess here's another example of recoloring. The original pages had square blocks around some of the text, right?
Okay.
Or they had the text in between panels, or if there was an explosion, they had words in the explosion. So you kind of had to search the page for some of the writing. You had to look, there's, writing in between things. The recoloring, instead of keeping it squared or as part of images, in some of them, they just put like a starburst behind it, or a sunburst.
Okay.
And it's like a Photoshop effect
right.
to sort of bring out some of that. And it just seems like, I don't know, to me, it just screams like, how do we make this jump out of the page? Well, with modern technology, we can put a big starburst behind it. And it really,
so it's more forced.
Yeah. And I don't know if it was meant to do that, because the original artwork was so dependent on you working your way through the page. And, there are good examples of it. And if you read it, I guess I could go back and forth on this all day, but my response is,
Yep.
I don't think it should be recolored. My response is, the artwork was okay, and I think everyone should read it in whatever format, because in the end, this was a pretty amazing run.
I'll take it.
Yeah, pretty amazing. So take it however you can get it however you can read it.
That's right.
And then just read it.
Yep.
But it was pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other part of the Swamp Thing that I thought was pretty cool, while I was going through and looking through the panels and everything like that, I was surprised by how little Swamp Thing is actually in the book. I mean, he's like in it
right
here and there, but you could tell there was, a big story around him, right?
Sure. Yeah. The supporting cast is very strong.
Yes.
That's what they spent a lot of the previous issues where Len Wein was helming it, and Martin Pasco and Jerry Conway and things like that. They were building these characters up, putting them through adventures. And so this is kind of like the revamp. They took these characters and they kind of were still using some plot threads from the old issues, but they were humanizing them. They were giving them more real life aspects to them, real life consequences to them.
Yeah, like the way Alan Moore writes is almost like how you would talk.
Yeah.
So, older comic books, or comic books in the 60s or 50s, or even some of the modern comics, they'll say, hey, let's answer the call. And they'll say sort of, phrases which you kind of immediately takes you out of the real world. Like,
Right.
who would talk like that? Or like Spider-Man's,
quippy phrases.
Yeah, they're weird. Those spots, or his Aunt May will say, hello, Peter. Here are some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I hope
And
you
there's
enjoy
ton of
them.
narration.
Yeah, and
Ton of narration.
you're like, it's just so weird. Like, who just does speech like that?
Yeah.
So Alan Moore was writing, and a lot of it was just them. There's a lot of ums, and there's a lot of pauses, and there's a lot of people who are saying, like they're just sort of asking or begging, or like he uses that common
Yeah, like let's take a
stance.
random phrase like "Your way, Woodrow." The Green did not do this. You did.
Yeah, and then or people would be like, this sort of like tension between the husband and wife, and you can
Yep.
tell that they don't really get along with each other. So they sort of write them where you can tell their sentences just sort of end because they don't care, and then they're awkward, and they're sort of like a broken marriage, and so you can pick up on that immediately because
Yeah.
they don't really like talk to each other coherently. They just sort of make sort of small talk, and that's sort of the beauty of it too, because comics only really have a small amount of time to flesh out these characters, give them a personality, tell you how they're supposed to act, and then continue.
Yeah, put him in different scenarios.
Yeah, and
how would they react to this or
and say
that?
we've set her up as a bold female lead, and you don't want 3 pages later for her to do something out of character because she's already been set up as a bold lead. So why would
Right.
she run? And so they only have a small amount of time to say this is how this character is going to act, and they're going to either always act like that, or they're going to step out of their comfort zone and become
Something greater or
a great
something, or
character.
either
Yeah.
they'll go away, or go like rise to the occasion, or
Yeah.
they'll die.
And that's a large part of even the Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
Is we haven't really talked about the Swamp Thing himself, Alec Holland, right?
Yes. So let's introduce the cast, I guess.
Yes, that's
for our new readers and podcast listeners. So Alec Holland is the Swamp Thing. He was a biochemist. He was doing some experimenting with this new formula he's working on, and he got sabotaged because the government or this other entity, this like military entity, I believe, they said, "Oh, we want that," but he didn't want to give it up. He's like, "Oh no, this will fall in the wrong hands." Typical hero tropes, I guess. And so they're like, "Well, if we can't have it, we're just going to burn you. We're just going to burn your house down with you and your wife in it." I don't know. So he, his wife doesn't make it, but he's on fire, goes in the swamp, falls in the swamp. The chemicals that were in the formula and the swamp water combine to make the Swamp Thing. Ooh.
the yummy biological goo of the swamp.
Yes. And then we're introduced to a supporting cast in the run of Abigail Arcane and Matt Cable. Those are his two main supporting cast members that you go and learn their friendships and support and why they matter to Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing is pretty removed when he starts out, so him forming relationships and everything and questioning his humanity is part of the journey of Swamp Thing.
Yeah, and at first he doesn't really understand if he is vegetable matter, like if he is an elemental or if he is a force of nature,
Yep.
or is he a man who's been mutated into the Swamp Thing.
Mhm.
And it is kind of cool to sort of take a step into this like almost godlike thought
Yes,
process.
elemental. What
Yeah.
what they described him, or Alan Moore described him, was like an elemental force.
So
And
he can
like-
tap into this part of the DC universe which is called the green. The green.
Ooh.
And it's everything that is growing and living and thriving, and the oceans and the swamps and the trees and roots, and just he is that. So he is like almost like Mother Earth's Avenger,
Yeah, in a way, yeah, I suppose that's about right.
So he has to, he feels that things are not right. So like some of the villains that are introduced, they somehow are um, perverting the forces of nature,
Yep.
or they're like using the powers of um, well, like using the powers of the plants or the insects
Yep.
against the world. And so that kind of creates an imbalance. So then the swamp thing's like, something's wrong.
Something's wrong in nature. I
I
can feel it,
I will
man.
be called and I will avenge. So
Right.
the way that Alan Moore, now, other writers would sort of write him, I think, as like
Just a horror
a
character.
brute,
Yeah, a
like
brute horror character. He was still questioning his humanity, but he's questioning like how I got here, not what I am.
it's like Frankenstein's monster of the forest. And
Yes, that's a good analogy for
yeah,
it. Yeah.
so then he's trying to tap into like, I was human, and as a human, I should care about these things, and I will, right these wrongs and avenge it.
Right.
And it is kind of a little bit of a journey that you see where he starts realizing that he is less human and more of a thing, but
Yep.
he doesn't
So
call himself like a monster. He gets a little sad a little bit sometimes.
yeah. So I guess just jumping into it, the first issue they really have, besides the first issue, I think the first two issues, 19 and 20, were a wrap up story, concluding like the old Bronze Age omnibus, which covered all the old material. And so after he got done with this, the wrap up, the first time they actually, with all the original concepts and everything, was number Saga of the Swamp Thing number 21. That's fably called the Anatomy Lesson.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, that was a great introductory issue into like how Alan Moore writes. And that very first paragraph,
Yep.
that's the defining moment where Alan Moore immediately got to say his own words, his own sort of stanza, and he sort of set the tone for the uh, entire
Yeah.
book, really.
Mm-hmm. I'll just read like a little bit of it here. It's raining in Washington tonight. Plump, warm summer rain that covers the sidewalks with leopard spots. Downtown elderly ladies carry their houseplants out to set them on the fire escape as if they were infirm relatives of boy kings. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was weird because the way that he explains sort of common day items, I mean, you can't help to just be reading through it and then just stop, And
He likes to describe every detail,
yeah,
like walking you
there's
through this world that he's building this scene.
yeah, that's what I was just looking up, because there's another part where he starts talking about paranoid schizophrenia.
Yep.
He starts talking about um incest and rape, and he talks about
Right.
just like the hospital of autistic children. And
Yeah, that's later on. Yeah.
there's just a lot of real world straight out of your neighbors and your community's problems and issues, and they put it right into the comic. And I think that really helped a lot of people take it seriously, because he wasn't afraid to say, you know um, we're going to write a horror comic and we're going to treat every reader as a advanced psyche, and just say these are themes that happen, and they're just themes of our world, and people are punished because of them, and there is a creature that can punish them, and that's what the swamp thing is.
Yep.
So it is really kind of a horror issue.
Right. And what Alan Moore describes in his interviews is like, if it was, I was trying to scare myself. Like it would scare me too. Like, and if it didn't, it wasn't good enough for him. Like he wants to feel those emotions and act them out when he was doing it. And if some, he wanted to dig into that
Yeah.
versus like the hokiness of like the slasher films and what comic horror was.
Right. And the other part of it too is that you get the idea that Alan Moore was in it for the long game, because he sort of did a slow burn. He
Yes.
laid some of these really interesting little nuggets, and then you didn't really see some of them come to fruition for maybe 3 or 4 issues, which
Yeah.
back in the day, you have to remember this was a monthly series.
Yeah,
So
literally.
a lot of times I always forget, when we have these collected editions, which is why we made the podcast, because we really like the collected editions as a a showpiece, a hardcover, generational book that is meant to be on bookshelves and read and handled and passed on. And back in the day when this came out, it was a single issue comic,
Yep.
and people would read it, and you can burn through one issue sometimes
Oh,
pretty fast.
yes, I did.
Because it's tense. It's quick. You're reading it. I made the mistake sometimes of just reading it like at night on my digitally, and it's
Yeah.
just like the whole room is dark because you're staring at a digital screen. You don't realize it, and then it's like, this is straight up horror. But you remember back in the day, it would be, you would read this, it would end, and then you'd have to wait another whole month.
Yeah, that would be agonizing.
See what's happening.
We're used to the binge world now. Now it's like, okay,
we want it all lined up for us.
right.
All of
and
it.
then when I got done with this book, I was like, and now what?
Yeah.
Okay.
What's the next part?
Let's creeping out the corner. But I think he did a really good job with Anatomy Lesson, because he breaks down what Swamp Thing was and is, and he's building. He's going deep into like all his organs and like his facial structures and different like his body. And the villain, he is trying to become what Swamp Thing is, but his own version of it.
Because he sees it as a powerful entity.
Yep.
People want to.
He ends up becoming the Floronic Man. And I guess Floronic Man was introduced in a very early Justice League run. And he took this character and he said, oh, this is the perfect villain for him. And really just vamped the crap out of him and brought him to like scary. He wrote it, just dug into it. And his battle against the Floronic Man is one of the really great standout issues and runs that was part of this that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and a large part of the ongoing story is these, like we said, all of these. I'm trying to think here. The best way to say it is, a large part of the story is all of these characters living their own lives, and then you see that there are issues and problems, and so Swamp Thing comes up, and then you realize, oh, they're not just basic issues and problems, they're crazy out there, very adult problems. So what was happening was Alan Moore was writing his story, I think, into a little bit of a wall, and the wall was the comics code. So the comics code started in the 50s when there were real horror, like comics, like real horrors, and it's pretty. If you look it up, it's pretty famous as an old means to an end, because back in the 50s and 60s they had comics sitting on the stands with severed heads and zombie faces and eyeballs and people rising from the
Guts
graves
and gore
and things. And it was literally right next to Archie Comics. So then the problem was you're getting 5, 6, 8-year-olds, and they're being subjected to all of that. So it quickly turned into a worldwide hysteria of comic books are polluting the minds of our youth.
Yes.
And the
Star Comics.
Yes. And so parents, they threw out everyone's comic collections, and it was a terrible day. But then they said the only way that comics can continue is if you have a comics code governing what is in it and what it says. Now, famously, Mad Magazine, who owned a lot of those kind of crazy ones, they said, oh, well, we're not a comic, we're a magazine now.
Sure. So
they can get around the code.
I think Heavy Metal Magazine was a similar deal.
Yeah. So they were like, we're a magazine. Oh, yeah. We're just like everything else. So then Marvel and DC said, you know what? we may as well just go with the comics code because we want to make sure that our comics are still promoted and our comics are still on the newsstands. And, they had a lot of regulations on where you could promote it and where you could put it.
Yeah.
And so from 1954, I think it was, or 56, till Saga of the Swamp Thing number 29,
30.
number 30.
Yes.
And that was, well, I had number 31 actually being printed in December 1984. So, you're looking at the tail end of December when they finally said, we've got this issue together. It took us all these times, Alan Moore sending the script over. And
Yeah, I was talking about
So
that.
it's like,
Yeah.
all right, we got this issue. Send it to the Comics Code quick.
Yep.
And they sent it in.
And they're like, nope, sorry, you can't do it.
Sorry,
and
this is terrible.
yeah, they're like, oh, it's too much. You can't use it. And the DC is like, oh, they went back to Alan Moore and they're like, hey, can you do anything? And they went back to the team with Len Wein. He went, oh, can we do anything? Nope.
It was gotta run. It's gotta run.
He's like, all right, you gotta push it. So they're like, they took a gamble, and it was part of the editors that really did a good job of, kind of pushing it through and seeing what happens.
So then here they had an issue of Swamp Thing, which now had been worked into the popular world, because you remember that Alan Moore started writing in issue 20. And so here you're on issue 30. And in 10 or 11 quick issues, he turned it around into saying, this doesn't need the comics code to survive. This comic is now popular enough that people are buying it right off the shelves because they can't wait to read the next issue. So DC ran it without the comics code. His first comic ever printed since 1954.
31. Sorry.
Oh, number 31.
Yep.
And they ran it, and it was, of course, a big seller, big hit. It was a great story. And it just kept leading into more. And then DC Comics said, you know what? If that one survived without the code, let's not use the code anymore on Swamp Thing. I think they still had it on their other issues, but so Swamp Thing just continued from there. Eventually, fast forward another 25 years, and Marvel and DC just said, we don't need the comics code at all. And nobody uses it nowadays. But it really was a big governing piece, and it really held back a lot of artists.
I could see why they did it now. Looking back at the issue, yeah.
It held, yeah. You're like, what was so wrong? Oh, I get it.
From not getting sucked into the story. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, but it held back a lot of artists and writers, I'm sure. And, some of the stories, because you can look it up, like what passed the comics code and what didn't. And it was like, oh, there was a slight turn of this female and you could see too much, or, oh, these teenagers are kissing and we don't want to see teenagers kissing. And they would stop the comics just dead in their tracks and say, you can't print this. Yep. And, some of the larger companies, they were really governed by it. And they said, we're not going to push the envelope too much. They tried here and there, and sometimes they snuck some things through.
Yeah.
But it was probably better just not to.
So they retitled the Swamp Thing Sophisticated Suspense Swamp Thing. And
which I thought was awesome.
Right. Alan Moore was like, when we did that, we had really good hopes that maybe parents would think, oh, that's probably not for the kid. But adults would be like, hey, that sounds cool. Oh, what's that?
And I just want to touch on one more thing too. I mean, there are some great overall themes in this book, but one theme that really got me was how DC Comics, which is, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, all of those guys. DC Comics handles Swamp Thing going to hell. And he goes and he is on a rescue mission.
Yep. But Abigail, one of the female supporting member, Abigail Arcane, you don't find out later that she's like really interested in for the relationship, but there's always like this tension between the two characters.
Yeah, he's sort of the grotesque in
Yeah.
love with a
Beauty and the Beast
female
classic,
human. Yeah.
Um,
So he
but
goes to
yeah, her soul's in hell. And so he wants to go to the end of the earth to get her back and whatnot. So he's like, okay, let's go do
yeah.
that.
And on one hand, it's a fun way to bring in some other characters in the DC universe that are, demons and more powerful figures like the Spectre and things like that. But yeah, on the other hand, I thought it was interesting because DC Comics versus Marvel Comics, DC actually does have heaven and hell. It has
Yep.
Cain and Abel. It has
Hmm.
um, Olympian gods, Zeus, things like that. So, in DC Comics, they are very much into religion based heaven and hell. Marvel Comics doesn't have that. They have
No.
cosmic entities and
Right.
cosmic
They
powers.
have different types of like hell, and they have different realms, and like play up more on the cosmic side.
They have people who run those, but it's not necessarily like,
Traditional.
yeah,
Yeah.
like there's really no god that you would show up at,
Yeah.
and they had everything, eternity and the cosmos and everything else is sort of handled by those beings
Yeah.
running
Over
that.
the top.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think it gave an important sounding board for Alan Moore.
Right.
Like he finally got to sort of write his sort of 7 layers of hell idea. And,
Sure. That makes
Alan
sense.
Moore himself kind of gets into a lot of those arcane and sort of mystical thoughts. And that's kind of where he ended up leading his life to as a pretty interesting person. But it really took Swamp Thing to that next beyond everything.
Well, and I like that with the
level.
annual that it's not wasted. It's not doing some other random story. It's not doing some random story. Like some annuals, like they just kind of do off their own venture and then say, "Oh, we'll be back next week with the real story." So I
Yeah.
like that he actually uses it, and then he also pays tribute in the first annual to Jack Kirby's The Demon.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
he
so
does a
that
great
was,
job.
a character that it was in a flash band. Jack Kirby did it, and then it was kind of gone. So we kind of retooled that character to the way he wanted to write it, and he still uses some of the themes that had. So I really enjoyed seeing the demon come back and interact with Swamp Thing. And
Yeah,
how this
and-
cast of characters like.
And you're using characters from other writers is always a great homage. And it's always great for writers to say, I know what I'm doing. Now I'm going to work in a character that's been around for 10 years. I'm going to work him into my story in a new way or a different way, or, like all of a sudden they're just there and you're like, that's great. It's, it's like having these starring characters or returning actors and things show up again too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I would say my final thoughts on it. It's a great, great, great story. I mean, you can see all over the place that people are saying, Alan Moore, Swamp Thing, gotta read it, gotta have it.
Yeah.
And I would say, get it in a great format for yourself. Get it in the absolute format. If you don't mind the recoloring, get it in just whatever else you can. They do have trade paperback collected editions of that too, but the absolute is pretty amazing. So I would say it's a great part of your collection, and we hope that hardcover collected editions are something that we are exciting you about, and we will be continuing with more podcasts from here.
Yes. We definitely look forward to doing more episodes and challenging ourselves to read new cool creative books and everything, and for sure continuing the hardcover line. I also encourage anybody who wants to know more about the characters to revisit the Bronze Age Swamp Thing omnibus.
Origins.
Even just to pick a few things here and there that interest you. It's definitely will help you give a great understanding before you leap into Alan Moore.
Yeah.
But I think either way, it's still a great story. I enjoy the heck out of it. There's a volume 2 that just came out. So excited to dip into that.
Is there a volume 3 coming?
Volume 3 is on the pipeline. Yeah, It's announced. It'll be in I think the spring or summer. So
it never ends, my friends.
Never ends. So thanks for checking out the podcast, and we'll see you next time. This is Andrew Lar
and Chris Ramos. Thank you. Bye bye.